Welcome to ePathshala lecture series for MArch students. In this particular module, we shall go further and we can see more of the other visual characters that we can observe in plants. So, in this module, we will see about the visual characteristics and plants and types, and then we would see about the line and pattern, which is one of the visual characters that could be observed in plants, and the visual character of texture, and finally, the visual character of color that could be observed in plants. We would see a lot of these type of visual characters and we could go ahead in detail. So, we will start about looking at the line and pattern that has been observed in the plants. So, line is closely related to the two dimensional effect of the edges of the plants that you can see. So, the two dimensional effect of the edges define how the line of a plant is being observed or being visualized at. So, it becomes an abstraction of the three dimensional quality of the plant. The edges that create line can be the edges of a whole plant mass or of its branches, stems, leaves or petals, or the edges between different materials of colors, between light and shadow falling on the surface of the plants. Composite patterns of lines are formed on the surface of things, and although these surfaces may be curved or bent, they can be perceived from one viewing point as if they are on a two-dimensional plane. A pattern of lines can, by means of perspective, convey information about the three-dimensional shape of objects, but this requires interpretation of the two-dimensional pattern based on experience of moving through space. So, even before we look at how we perceive a particular form of a plant, it is important how the lines, the two-dimensional lines create or generate that kind of pattern in the particular facade of the plant, so that the silhouette is being created and then we could perceive the form of the plant eventually. The essence of line is direction, being the result of movement of a point in space. In visual composition, the primary effect of line is to lead our eyes and direct our attention. Although we do not necessarily follow each line faithfully to its end, our vision will nevertheless tend to move backwards and forwards along the stronger lines and follow the compounded direction of weaker and shorter lines. Our attention will tend to rest at the places where lines converge. So, line can be used to direct the visual exploration of a space. So, these are different ways we can see and look at lines and understand them conceptually and be able to select the right kind of plant when it comes to the plant section. So, we can see a few different types of lines that are here. One is the ascending lines. As you can see in this photograph, that the lines are more ascending or erect kind of character. So, you can see these are the lines which ultimately define what an erect form is or an ascending form is. So, it is expressed in the outlines of plants with columnar or fastigate shapes, in the trunks of strong growing trees, in the vigorous stems of shrubs and herbaceous plants, and hard pruned in the shapes of flower spikes, and in sword shaped leaves of some monocotyledons. So, we can see this kind of line characters in different types of plants. So, these kind of ascending lines is very assertive and emphatic and can state, and it can be stately or grand if it is on a sufficient scale. So, ascending line is a very prominent line because it opposes the direction of gravity. So, we saw in all the erect forms, ascending forms are very striking characters, and what gives them the striking character is the ascending lines that are being found in these kind of forms, so that they give a sense of being opposed to the direction of gravity. Yet a vertical line by itself exists in a state of tenuous balance, and least movement in any lateral direction will offset its alignment and reduce its considerable potential energy. So, that it's also subject to certain kind of conditions by which the kind of erect forms or the vertical lines could be altered in such a way. So, once if that is offset or altered, then these kind of forms or these kind of lines could kind of decrease the potential energy, visual energy of that particular plant itself. This sense of delicate balance gives an air of achievement to strongly expressed vertical line, but if it is used without discretion and order, it can be restless and overbearing. So, there needs to be a certain kind of restraint when one is using very erect form and an ascending form, so that the vertical lines that are being created express a strong character, and it should be used in the proper, as we discussed earlier, it should be used in the proper numbers, so that the character is being maintained and the respective character of that particular form is being highlighted in the best possible extent. So, we could see here a few ascending lines, the very strong vertical lines like the Racina marginata, very strong vertical lines that you can see here. So, they are very energetic, very emphatic, it can be grand. So, you can see very strong lines which are being generated, and these lines ultimately define the erect form or the other forms. The other one is the pendulous or the descending line, which is found in the branches of weeping trees and in shrubs, in hanging stems like the different examples that you see on screen, and in plants with hanging leaves or flowers, etc. That you could see here in this particular picture. The leaves are more falling, and they exhibit a very weeping habit that you could see here. So, pendulous line is characteristically restful, bringing a peacefulness to its scene. So, unlike the vertical or the erect forms, we see that the pendulous line is more restful in its character and very serene, and it suggests that it is letting go of the struggle with gravity and weeping branches. So, it sets itself up with kind of minimum effort. Perhaps because there is less resistance, less vitality in their habit, pendulous plants can reflect a melancholy mood that it might be strong, particularly strong felt if it is combined with somber dark color. So, it is how we mix up and how we set up that particular kind of qualities of the lines themselves. The weeping foliage of branches draw our attention down to the ground, and this can give a sense of weight. So, it looks like the entire weight is sitting on the ground itself. So, the presence of a contrasting lively element such as water below the canopy is the perfect complement to a weeping tree or shrub. So, these kind of pendulous lines, so since it is going down to the ground and if a light element like water or river bed is coming very close to these pendulous lines, then it gives a very good contrast in terms of how we use and look at the quality of these lines themselves. There is also an affinity between the character of water and the flowing cascading forms of weeping trees, hence the traditional association between the two. So, there is a very good chance of these forms themselves. So, some of the pendulous lines that you can see here are the Salix babylonica that you see. They are very good plants, very close to water bodies, a very strong weeping habit that you can see here in this particular picture. And at the shrub level, yes, you have the Racelia equisetiformis, so which is again you could see the weeping habit of the plant itself, and it tends to fall towards the ground, and they are very serene, very softer kind of line forms that can be visualized. Then you have the tablet form that we saw earlier, and these tablet forms are very strongly created by the horizontal lines of the branches and the foliages along the top of the clipped hedges. So, this is the branches of the foliage which are there, and in the bouncing line that forms the base of the tree canopy. So, very strong horizontal lines that decide the character of the plant itself. So, it can without these to lift up, indeed without these to lift it, the planting can appear featureless and lifeless. And as we saw earlier, that the tablet form gives a very stable kind of expression. So, horizontal lines also give a very strong stability in terms of the plant massing itself. So, something that is very strong, something that is being set up one on top of each other. So, all these act as very good elements to create a very stable visual landscape as such, rather than something which falls down or something which is standing on its own. So, the direction line represents a state of stability. Its character is passive, like a reclining figure. It contains little potential energy, and so implies little movement or little effort. because of its visual stability, planting with strong horizontal line can act as a foundation that will support the more active elements of composition. So, we see here just like the tablet forms, the horizontal lines are very stable in their character, they are very strong and standing, and you can see the stability that is there. Yeah, you can see how it's like one is decked on top of the other. So, very strong horizontal lines which brings out the character of the space. Then you have the diagonal lines. This is seen in sharply rising branches found occasionally in many trees and shrubs, but more consistently in a few species and cultivars such as Prunus canzan and Sorbus sargentiana. The stiff linear leaves of some monocotyledons are held at a strong diagonal, although they are usually spread over a range of angles. So, you could see very strong diagonal lines here, which are expressed here in this type. So, something like the vertical lines, they are also energetic, dynamic, they are exciting. It expresses a certain level of tension, and it has high potential energy. It looks like it gives an impression of thrusting out against gravity, moving upwards and forwards, a forceful quality which makes it a powerful element in the composition itself that is seen. So, where you have horizontals and more tablet or a pendular form, you introduce one or two diagonal lines here and there, and that creates a kind of that has its own potential energy, and it creates that kind of striking character when it being mixed with the other plants as such. But at the same time, too much of strong diagonals would cause disintegration of the composition, and a solid foundation is needed to support the dynamic nature and eye catching qualities of a diagonal line. So, one also needs to have a very strong base as to how the diagonal lines are being set up. So, you can see very strong diagonal lines, and you can see how the foundation is being set up for this particular diagonal quality to be expressed and to be highlighted in the picture that you are seeing here, especially with the agave plant that you can see here. Then we come to another character, which is the texture of the plant itself. So, plant texture can be defined as the visual roughness or the smoothness of any part of the plant. It is akin to the texture of a painting, the grain of a photograph, or the consistency of materials such as fabric, stone, brick or wood. So, the texture is how the visually how rough or how smooth a plant looks when I look at it. Is it very fine in texture, or is it very softer, other spots very fine, and also it also depends on at what distance a particular plant is being viewed, and based on the distance that we view a plant, so also is one differentiates that kind of texture. So, different viewing angles and viewing distances also play a very good role in how a plant is being perceived with respect to its texture, and by using the right texture with respect to the angle or the distance of viewing, then one can create the right kind of impressions in the designed environment. So, texture is a function of the scale of differentiation and division within a material. It may be the result of a pattern of lines. If so, it is determined only by the scale of the pattern and not by the direction of the lines. A plant of commonly referred to as having coarse, fine or medium texture. So, we would be seeing about 3 different types that that could be generally observed in plants, that is the fine texture, the medium texture and the coarse texture. So, it also, as I discussed earlier, depends on the viewing distance. So, when you see it from a moderate distance, a texture looks like one, and if you go more closer, the leaves are much bigger, you are looking at it closer, and thereby you perceive that as having a more coarser texture. So, you would see a different types of textures as such. So, as you move far away from the visual effect of individual leaves and twigs will be lost, and the canopy will appear to be made up of clusters or sprays of foliage. So, as I said discussed earlier, like the viewing distance matters most as to how we perceive the texture of a plant. So, if I am close to a plant, then I am looking at more closely at the flowers, the texture of the flowers and the leaves and the small twigs which are there. But as I keep moving back and as my viewing distance increases, all that I get to see now is the canopy, the silhouette, the overall form, and only the sprays of the foliage, maybe like a cassia. I could see only the sprays of the foliage or the flowering patterns together as a whole form, and thereby my textural understanding of that particular or textural viewing of the particular plant varies. So, it is important like how a plant is going to be is seen and at what distance it is going to be seen, that is quite important and necessary to be understood when we are dealing with planting design. Plants made up of large clearly differentiated branches will appear more coarsely textured. So, depending on the leaf size and patterns, we could understand what kind of texture is there in the particular plant. If the viewing distance is so great that only the visible differentiation of vegetation is between the whole plants or between clumps of trees or shrubs, texture will depend on the spacing of individual shrubs and trees or clumps. Okay. So, it's the viewing distance that matters and how we perceive a particular texture. Widely spaced clumps and separate canopies will give the landscape a coarser grain than even interlocking canopies, which will appear more finely textured. So, different ways of looking at textures, and first we see the fine texture. So, the fine texture plants are those with the smallest leaves or the leaflets and the finest most closely packed twigs. The fine textured plants tend to be easy to look at and it is more relaxing than stimulating. They can give the impression of being at a greater distance than coarse textured plants and are said to recede in the field of vision. So, you can see from this example of buxus that the leaf texture, this is said to be a fine texture because of the small leaves or the small leaflets, and they are more closely packed twigs that are seen. So, when I look at it, it is more easy, very comfortable to look at, it is very relaxing to look at, and because of its very fine texture, it tends to recede in the field of vision. It just goes and merges with the background and it recedes as in the field of vision that we could see here. As a result of high proportion of fine textured plants increases the sense of spaciousness. So, because it recedes in the field of vision, there is a sense of spaciousness that is being brought within the enclosure, rather like the effect of fine textured or small pattern wallpaper in a room. Just like very fine textured wallpaper in a room which does not show out the detailing more, and thereby it increases the spatial quality of the room with respect to its visual aspect. So, also fine textured plants also brings in a certain level of spaciousness to a design landscapes, and that is very important, and their character is light and airy, expansive and soft. A further effect of fine textured foliage is that the overall outline and form of the plant is strongly expressed and it can be easily traced. So, because of the fine texture, because of the smaller leaves, the overall form can be easily expressed. The shape of the whole plant will usually dominate the shapes of individual leaves and stems. For this reason, fine textured plants are valuable in formal composition where there is strict control of pattern is the essence of design. So, where you have a very formal composition where there is a very strict guideline on this is going to be the pattern, this is how the form should be expressed, it should be strictly dome or strictly oval. So, in those kind of situations, a fine texture plant would be an automatic choice because it can highlight that particular form very effectively and very strongly. Here the outlines of planted areas, the planting of geometric patterns, the shaping of edges and clip specimens are all expressed with greater precision by the fine textured species. So, that is why the fine textured species play a major role in the trained form, where all the smaller leaves are being trained, all the smaller leaves are being clipped, so that the required form or the decided form is being clearly or very effectively shown out in the design landscape. So, you can see a few of the fine textures, like as I said, how much we perceive the plant as such with respect to the pattern, the foliage, at a distance, yes, you can see only the sprays of foliage which are there, but when one moves closely, one is able to observe the leaf patterns and the twigs as such. So, but when one moves back, one could only see the overall form in with respect to a fine textured plant. And yes, the sprays of foliage which are being created by means of the branching patterns of that particular plant itself. Then we see the coarse texture. The largest leaves and the thickest twigs have the coarse and the boldest visual. So, we saw the smaller leaves forming the fine texture. So, in contrast, the largest leaves and the thickest twigs have the coarsest or the boldest visual texture. So, plants with bold foliage and stems are primarily attention grabbers because of its very strong character. They are attention grabbers, perhaps because the form and detail of their foliage is clearly visible from a distance. So, unlike fine textured plants which are more which tends to recede in the field of vision, these type of large leaves are being the shape and the quality and the form of the leaves themselves can be perceived from a larger distance, and perhaps simply because of their size. So, because of the size and scale, one can perceive them at a larger distance and thereby making them very strong, so that they could advance in the field of vision. So, indeed the shapes of individual leaves tends to break up the outline of plant. So, the outline or the entire form of the plant is not as significantly visible or significantly emphasized as in a fine textured plant, but here the plant the leaves themselves are get that kind of attention in the particular overall form. So, in this case the plant's qualities of line arise from the edges of leaves and twigs rather from the mass of the canopy. So, we see the more detailing with respect to the leaves and twigs more than the massing of the entire planting canopy itself. The boldness of coarse textured plants makes them appear to advance in the field of vision. This effect can be employed to increase the sense of depth in planting composition if coarse textures are placed in the foreground and finer textures kept mainly to the background. So, by means of positionally setting up where a fine texture or where a coarse texture is being employed, one can work on the depth that could be established in a particular planting composition. In a confined area, however, too much bold advancing foliage can cause claustrophobic can cause a very claustrophobic atmosphere. So, care is needed when using coarse texture in small spaces. As we saw in earlier situations, like by using erect forms, when using erect forms or ascending forms or diagonal forms, a certain amount of restraint is important to be used, because they have very strong characters of having high potential energy. In the same way, coarse textured plants or the bigger leaf plants should also be used with a certain level of restraint, so that it does not create a very claustrophobic atmosphere because of their leaf size as such. So, it is very important it is being employed in the right way. The large leaves of coarse textured plants throw big shadows, create striking patterns of light and shade. If the plant has glossy leaves, then it can with the reflected light they can add to the visual impact of bold foliage, and thereby it also can make a specimen plant. So, it is not only the leaf size, but also the quality, whether it is a matte leaf or a glossy leaf, not only creating light and shadow, but also to a certain extent if it is a glossy plant, then it creates the reflection and making it more striking as such. And it can create emphasis, axis, and also it creates this emphasis within a composition because of its boldness. It is an eye catching character, it becomes an accent plant because it advances in the field of vision. It can provide markers to identify key locations. So, it can be, as I said, emphasis creators as emphasis makers. So, it is very important that these things are being put in the right place, so that one can identify any particular spot in a particular design landscape as to being a significant point of transition or arrival in many ways. So, some of you can see the larger leaf sizes which are there. So, all these are classified under the coarse texture and also the agave. So, very strong characters, very strong leaf sizes and patterns, very striking with terms to the visual character themselves. And in between of these fine and coarse texture is what we see the medium textured plants, which is where you can see a noticeable contrast. So, what do these type of medium texture plants do is that they tend to bridge the gap between the fine and the fine and the coarse texture. So, they are more gap fillers, and it brings about a kind of sequence in the composition, and it also allows the eye to absorb the range more easily by making a smooth progression rather than a sudden variation from a fine to a coarse texture. So, a medium textured plant or a leaf also brings in that kind of gentleness, or it brings in that kind of visual stability or smoothness when looking at plants with different types of textural qualities like fine and coarse. So, the contrast is significantly broken down when we use that. Another visual character is color themselves. So, color is the property of light, and it arises because of the differences in the properties of light, mainly wavelength, amplitude and energy as such. And also these differences are caused by both the nature of the light source and the reflection, refraction and absorption of the light before it reaches the observer's eye. The color of light can be described in terms of three fundamental qualities, that is the hue, value, tone and saturation. So, it is important to have a general understanding as to what is hue. Hue is generally the color of a particular planting object itself. So, it is a quality by which a color is said, like this is a red color or a yellow color or so on. So, it is determined by the wavelength of the light that is there. The natural spectrum is conventionally perceived to have 7 hues, which is red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo and violet. Although on close inspection each is seen to grade continuously into its neighbors through intermediate hues. So, you have the color cycle, the color wheel. So, we can see these 7 colors in the spectrum, and the hues of the spectrum are as pure and as can be observed within the Earth's atmosphere, because they arise from the refraction of the sun's light rather from the absorption by pigments. When we come and say about value, value is also referred as tone, as the quantity of luminosity of the light. So, in terms of hue, we say a color is red or green, but with respect to value we can understand whether it is the lightness or the darkness of the color. Is it light green or dark green? So, that refers to the value, because it is the quantity of luminosity of the light, how much light is reflected back from that colored surface, that actually shows what kind of value that particular plant has. So, value is something, another character that needs to be understood. It is like more like the black and white photograph, which shows differences only of value, the dark, the black and the white. So, it's not, there is no kind of progression there. So, it is the brightest surface, reflective surface. So, the bright surface has a high value, and the light tone and the dimmest or the least reflective surface has the low value, that is the black color. So, it is so based on understanding the values or the hues, or looking at colors with respect to the different dimensions of the color pattern itself, the amount of light that is reflected from it, one can understand what kind of levels of values or tones can be seen in the particular plant material itself. In the areas of shadows or as dusk approaches, all tones will be darker and apparent difference between tones will be reduced. So, also we see that value is also dependent on the type of light that is incident on that particular material. So, the values changes throughout the daytime and the changing seasons of the atmospheric cycle. Finally, we have the saturation, that you see the degree of the color, whether it is very strongly red or pale red. So, this is one criteria by which we say that a color has a certain relativeness when compared with the same color group. Okay. So, it gives us a measure of relative colorfulness. A bright red and a dull red may have the same value, but the bright red will be distinguished by its greater saturation. So, higher saturation for a bright red, a lower saturation value for the dull red as such. So, it is also known as intensity, the purity or the chroma. The term saturation might be preferred because it suggests the origin of the quality of the color. So, it is important how we understand. So, different types of plants or colors of the plants cause different types of color effects. Red is more energetic and powerful, it is more advancing in the field of vision. Orange has a certain level of red in it, and also it becomes warm and advancing, it becomes lively and vital, possessing some of the quality of the red, but it is tempered by the yellow it contains. So, a certain amount of red and yellow are there in orange. So, it has that kind of warm and advancing character within it. So, more like your heliconias and all. Yellow is warm, but the red slightly comes down without the passion of red, but again it is a cheerful color, it stimulates and also tends to advance when it is combined with recessive hue. So, when we use a recessive hue and use yellow, then it tends to advance. So, colors are also how you make to advance a color is also how you combine them with another color itself, another hue itself. So, it's using such kind of methods one can bring out the visual effects. Green is a very neutral color, it is warm and it is neither warm nor cool, it neither recedes or advances. It is the light or the color which is very easy for the human eye to look at, and it requires the least effort by the ocular muscles. So, green allows the sharpest distinction of contour and outline. So, green gives a very sharp contour and outline of the particular landscape itself. Blue is the coolest hue, it resists unlike the red or the yellow, it recedes in the field of vision, and also it is calming and serene, but also expansive. It is also expansive and inspiring, it gives a sense of spaciousness as we come closer to white. So, indigo and violet, again you see that it has a bit of blue and red. Because of the blue it is cool and receding, but a slight amount of red gives an uplifting quality that can be little bit mysterious. White is the combination of all hues of the spectrum, it is neither neutral, it is favoring, it favors none. So, it is neither advancing or receding, and a white flower appeared warm. It also depends on the incident light. A white flower would appear warm and advancing in the golden or red light of sunset, sunrise and sunset, but cool and receding in blue twilight. So, depending when there is a white colored plant or white colored flower, we can use it accordingly with respect to the different characters. So, plants exhibit a lot of variations with respect to visual characters like line, form, color and texture. The better understanding of these qualities will help the designer to rightly use them in the design landscape to bring out the designed intent of the space. Proper composition and setting up right environments to highlight the visual characters will add to strengthening the visual quality of the space. If one could have an eye for detail, then one could make a strong statement by employing the right visual characteristics of plants. So, it is not only understanding the qualities and the characters, but being able to use them in the right combination and have an eye for detail and use every small character that a plant is so blessed with, and use them in the right way, and so that the created landscape design is striking and it meets all its functional as well as its aesthetical goals as such. So, thank you.